Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. The war in the Ukraine is a battle between Western civilization and the civilizational system of Vladimir Putin. It is a battle between democracy and dictatorship. This raises a question. Why fight to save Western civilization? Every belief system that appeals to our idealism claims that it will lift the poor and the oppressed. But Western civilization, the Western system, has lifted the poor and oppressed more than any other system in history. Judge for yourself. If you'd been born in 1850, your expected lifespan would have been 37.5 years. If you'd been born in the West in 2000, your expected lifespan would have been 78.5 years. Chinese emperors were willing to spend almost all of their wealth to achieve an extra 4 years of life. But Western civilization has added another 40. Western civilization has more than doubled the human lifespan. No other civilization in the history of the world, not the Chinese, Egyptian, Muslim, Russian, or Roman, has ever pulled this off. Fact 2. If you'd been the poorest paid worker in London in 2012, a personal assistant, you would have earned what an entire tenement full of the poorest paid workers in London were paid in 1850. You would have earned what 7 Irish dock workers made. If you gave, point 3, if you gave a bunch of average Western kids today a Stanford Binet IQ test from the first year it was administered, 1916, today's kids would register as near geniuses. They'd register an average IQ of roughly 135. That's an IQ jump of 35 points. Since 1650, Western civilization is up the level of peace by a factor of 10. If you were in an indigenous culture, one of those lovely tribes that lives in peace with its fellow man and in harmony with nature, your odds of dying a violent death at the hands of a human being would have been 10 times what they are in the West today. Yes, thanks to Western civilization, there is 10 times more peace in the world today. Next point. If you were born in 2000, your height would have been 4 inches higher than if you'd been born in 1850. Final point. The Western system has lifted close to 1 billion people out of poverty in a mere 20 years. If our great-great-grandparents could give us an extra 40 years of life, we owe an extra 40 more to our great-great-grandchildren. If our great-great-grandparents could septuple the incomes of the poorest paid workers among us, surely we owe another septupling to our great-great-grandkids. If our great-great-grandparents could up the average IQ by 35 points, surely we owe at least another 35 to our great-great-grandkids. And if our great-great-grandparents could increase the peace in the world by a factor of 10, surely we owe our great-great-grandkids 10 times more. But to carry out this obligation, we need to see and value what we've achieved. And we need to tenaciously defend the civilization that has given us these gifts. We need to realize that Western civilization is not the worst civilization in the history of mankind. It is the best. And we need to defend its values, freedom of speech, tolerance, and democracy. Topping all that, we need to defend Western civilization's greatest hidden secret, a perpetual balancing act between 3 elements: government, private enterprise, and the protest industry. So what is the Western system? What are Western civilization's core values? Democracy, pluralism, tolerance, and freedom of speech. The result? Western civilization is the only civilization in the history of the world that has ever invented human rights, the abolition of slavery, the concept of freedom, individualism, the peace movement, the anti-imperialist movement, diversity, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the concept of equality, the environmental movement, a concern about endangered species, a concept of animal rights, the idea of global warming, and the desire to save the planet. If Western civilization goes, all of these things go with it. Under the Russians, the Chinese, or the Muslims, all of these would disappear and be replaced by the requirement to say only what the authorities want you to say. No more rights, no more LGBTQ, no more protests, in Afghanistan, imprisonment in the house for women, and the right to beat your wife. We must keep Western civilization alive, and we must keep Western civilization striving for a glittering future for all of humankind. And right now, that means defeating Vladimir Putin in the Ukraine and making sure he doesn't get what he's going for. 40% of Europe, all of Eastern Europe. This is Howard Bloom speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make, or, want to know why, ask how. And now for the sleazy, slimy, sleazy little off button.